Okie dokie. Great. Hi, how are you doing? All that crap. Um, I got a couple images below. This image is less than a third of the picture, and then we'll go on to this next image in a second. So please, sound like a weird TV show from, like click on the image below and follow along with me. But please do. Click on the two images below and follow along with me. I'll be doing a reading of a part of one section of my lecture on magnetism out in Idaho here. Let's talk about polarity, because nobody knows what the hell magnetism is. They just don't. You could ask anybody and they don't have a clue. But further still, nobody knows what the term polarity is. We actually have to get into incommensurability and polarity. We think we know what polarity is. Well, like a magnet has two poles. That's not exactly the case. People misunderstand a line from Mother Nature's line. Like I said, this is less than a third of the picture here. We're going to migrate over to this image in a second and talk about true polarity, since polarity by definition, especially when we're speaking about magnetism, we are talking about force and motion. Magnetism and force and motion, and the statement, it creates space, quote unquote, is referring to one and exactly the same thing. So the notion that it creates space, which is equal to magnetism, which is equal to force, and understanding obviously so that the vortex that people actually speak about regarding either side of a magnet, or its quote unquote pole, is correct but incorrect. But people still don't know the definition of a vortex. So first, let's tackle polarity. This is how human beings draw a line here on the top. And of course, to draw a line, we first have to start at a point. But if we start at a point, to begin at a point is a Cartesian nexus, and Mother Nature does not draw a line like that. A Cartesian locus with an xy coordinate, xyz coordinate specifically, when we're talking three-dimensionally, is not how a line or polarity begins for Mother Nature, because we're actually starting in space. Here we drop a point on a piece of paper and we draw a line. First, let's start off two-dimensionally. Well, it's impossible for Mother Nature to draw a line like that. The beginning of a line, so to say, or a force vector, and I've actually created a 3D model of a force vector here, begins in counter space. And obviously a line from Mother Nature does not begin like a human line and go out. It begins from counter space and goes out. But that's, once again, only two-dimensionally. Let's migrate over to, this of course is still, since it's on a flat screen, still two-dimensionally, but let's actually extrapolate that out, since we know that magnetism and gyromagnetic precession exists, and we know we actually have a vortex on either side of a magnet. This would be the two-dimensional representation of a true line, where we actually have equal curvilinear, because there are no straight lines in nature. All lines in nature begin in counter space, and they are curvilinear. And there's a reason why they are curvilinear, because the spatial vector from Mother Nature is not only like this, it is like this. This is actually about the closest representation. It actually took quite a while to actually create this. I don't know if you could actually see it dimensionally, but we actually have equal curvilinear nature. This would be the zero nexus from a single force vector of Mother Nature. It's probably easier to look at it from this perspective, and I will slowly turn it so that you can see it. If it were bent absolutely perfectly, which oddly enough three-dimensional objects like this are hard to do, looking at it end on would form a perfect circle. But this would be a single three-dimensional force vector. You notice it has equal curvilinear divergence from a null nexus point, which is right about here. So let's talk about polarity, Mother Nature's polarity. Obviously, you notice here that extrapolating this out, only looking at a single force vector, we actually have the double vortex. And denotatively, if we actually draw the magnet around this, we actually have, the polarity, so to say, of magnetism. But first, let's talk about polarity, because human beings have no idea what the hell a vortex is, and they sure as hell have no idea what polarity is. Sure, a pole means it has two poles. That's a description. That's not an explanation. And we can't draw a line the way Mother Nature draws a line, because Mother Nature draws a line like this, and even that's only two-dimensional. Ultimately, the curvilinear three-dimensional force vector, which is denotative of force and motion, and To speak extrapolatively of magnetism, it creates space. We must speak of it three-dimensionally. In three-dimensional extrapolation of a single force vector, we actually have the creation of a vortex. But this vortex is the geomagnetic precession of the curved linear vectors which make up a single force vector of divergence from counter space, necessitatively so, magnetism being force in motion, as the magnetodielectric conjugate geometry of the magnetic field. This is the magnetodielectric conjugate geometry that we see in a magnet, which is not merely magnetism. Magnetism is actually just the dielectric field. Polarity is a nonsensical conceptual term to refer to a release of force from a point source. Magnetic polarity necessitates that one understand that a human line is not Mother Nature's line, which is from one non-Cartesian nexus in counter space and is three-dimensionally curved linear as necessitated by geomagnetic precession, and the native magnetic force vectors to be an expansive torus. Polarity in simplex is nature's force vector, which is divergent from counter space and curved linear, necessitatively so, since polarity is not merely two-dimensional. Obviously it cannot be, by the mere definition of force and motion itself, as meant magnetism, of which all force vectors and the statement "it creates space" is meant of magnetism. Dimensionally, polarity, which polarity is by definition, dimensional polarity, which polarity is by definition, cannot be merely linear, nor can it be straight. All of nature's lines are, of course, curvilinear and mutually divergent and centrifugal from non-Cartesian nexus, and manifest both two-dimensionally as curvilinear, but additionally so as necessitated by the definition of magnetism, which creates space, as precessional to the mass. Geomagnetic precession is only full and complete dimensional reification of polarity by definition, as it must be three-dimensionally divergent. It's not any more complicated than that. That sounds complicated, though, but it's actually not. Nature is extremely simplex, but that doesn't mean it's simple. Two-dimensional force, i.e. magnetism, divergence is impossible and illogical. Dimensionally, magnetism is an extrapolated vortex given multiple divergent vectors from each so-called pole. These force divergences are tied like a dog to a stake in the ground to the plane of inertia or the null nexus of dielectric inertia or counter space, regardless of the name which we give, which we wish to apply to it. At the center of all magnetic fields, there is no magnetism. At the center of gravity, there is no gravity. Retroductive logic necessitates that there is only one field, the dielectric, since magnetism is the dielectric field, being expressed in force and implied loss of inertia, and electrically is the construct of magnetism and dielectricity working in unison to create a self-reproducing energy construct which propagates, and gravity is merely incoherent dielectric acceleration, or point non-specific mutual mass acceleration towards a counterspatial vector, as implied the smallest possible volume, which it connotatively so must imply counterspace. Geomagnetic precession is the necessitated pressure mediation of magnetic polarity, which is, of course, three-dimensionally divergent. We can't speak of a simple loss of inertia and a force vector or nature's line in this two-dimensional fashion. Obviously so, a single force vector must be extrapolated out among all dimensions, three-dimensionally so, and this extrapolated out circumferential to the mass, of course, will end up with a torus. And, of course, the negative image of a torus, the geomagnetic torus, which defines the field modality of magnetism. The negative image of the torus, of course, is the hyperboloid, or if you don't know what a hyperboloid is an hourglass shape. A single force vector is not merely spatially divergent, but also necessitatively so mutually curvilinear, and herein is the double vortex formation and genesis of geomagnetic precession itself. Incommensurability and point source. This is really important to understand, and it's difficult for a lot of people to wrap their minds around. The incommensurability of a conjugate field in a magnet, being a magnetodielectric object, has presence relative to the bounding object we call the magnet, but there is no actual Cartesian value that can be localized in the magnet relative to any aspect of the fields themselves. This is what Tesla meant when he said there is no energy in matter other than that which it receives from its environment, as of course meant the ether itself. By the way, the principle of incommensurability was the greatest quote-unquote secret of the Pythagoreans. for which one person was summarily murdered for telling others the secret thereof. One cannot understand field incommensurability of the magnet without grasping the magnetodielectric hyperboloid at a fundamental level within your mind. Inertia cannot be measured by means of mass calculation. This very premise is the basis for every flaw of relativity, quantum, and mathematical atomism and non-Euclidean pseudophysics. There is no north and no south pole in a magnet. You cannot slice it and separate the two. You can't slice a magnet and separate out the north pole from the south pole, so to say. The fields are pressure forced to the respective locations. There is no Cartesian value of polarity in a magnet. That's an absolute undeniable fact. No location, no midpoint, no so-called block wall. It's just not there, as the term there implies of the ancient Greek topos, meaning place or location. There is no Cartesian locus anywhere that defines a specific pole or a block wall or a midpoint or a north pole or south pole in a magnet. That's undeniably the case. They are not located there. They have no Cartesian value. This is the incommensurability, the holographic paradigm. This is the point source field emission, also referred to when we speak of laser light, for example, as being spatially coherent. The incommensurability is spatially coherent like a laser. Spatially coherent light has another name. It's called sphere waves or plane waves, or even simpler, a pinhole light or a point source light. Coherent light is simple, which of course I grew up playing with lasers. And I always knew that the notion that a laser in explanation as coherent light was an absurdity. It just cannot simply be that. Coherent light is very simple. It's light which comes from a very small light source. Light from a single source is always coherent, since coherence requires at least two different Cartesian sources. And since incoherence requires two sources, the so-called lines of force seen in a magnet are merely constructive and destructive interference of the polarity, i.e. two sources, of the centrifugal divergence and centripetal convergence of the magnetism against the dielectric. Of course, it cannot exist any other way. A magnet, like a laser, is a field multiplicative phenomena by which point source emission is not additive but merely multiplicative in nature, or conventionally is meant power. A pre-magnet is quantitatively, obviously so, the same object with nearly infinite field, with near infinite field mutually destructive sources at the level of the atoms and the molecules themselves. Upon becoming a magnet, there is a point source incommensurability in the conjugate field of the magnet, which then creates the ab extra field phenomena around a magnet, which people think incorrectly is being emitted by the magnet. Rather, this ab extra field, of course, is the medium itself, i.e. the ether, as implied. In-phase emission, let's actually talk about point source and in-phase emission. Like in-phase emission causes the amplification of light. It doesn't cause coherent light itself. Because the atoms emit light in phase with incoming light, they will amplify the light, but the amplification of incoherent light too does not make it coherent. The coherency of a laser light has another source. Laser light has two main characteristics, and all of this goes to the understanding of the nature of a magnet and the field coherency. Laser light's two characteristics are that it's monochromatic or very pure in frequency, and this was referred to as temporal coherence. Laser light also has a point source characteristic of sphere waves and plane waves, and this is in reference to it being spatially coherent. For example, before lasers were even created, holograms were created. How was this done? Dennis Gabor invented holography before lasers existed. To create his pseudo-lasers, he just took light from an ordinary mercury arc lamp and passed it through a pinhole. Mercury emission lines made it nearly monochromatic, and the pinhole gave it the spatial coherence. It's also true of stars. Stars in the sky are point source light. Starlight has coherence links in thousands of kilometers. Starlight is far more coherent than any human-made laser light, and the most distant stars are just like ideal point sources. As a fact, astronomer A.A. Michelson discovered the star Betelgeuse, which is extremely close. Our closest star is far, far less coherent than other stars. That's because it's so damn close to us. Betelgeuse is our closest neighboring star. In-phase emission causes the amplification of light. It doesn't cause coherent light because the atoms generate light in phase with incoming light. They will amplify that light, but they amplify incoherent light too, and they don't make it coherent. The coherency of a laser light has another source, that being point source. I grew up with lasers, and actually the understanding of point source emission and coherency, people say, well, we're just talking about aligned domains. The simplest explanation for a magnet analogously, which is why I went into discussing lasers, is the understanding of the incommensurability and point source emission. This is where something becomes a multiplicative. This is why a 5-watt laser will burn a hole in your ass, but a 5-watt laser, a 5-watt light bulb is completely useless. You know, to even read a book by, a 5-watt light bulb is useless. But a 5-watt laser is really dangerous. And by the way, I have a 5-watt laser. Even a 500 milliwatt laser, let's actually take that even further. A 500 milliwatt laser is dangerous, much less a 5-watt laser. 5-watt laser is some really powerful, depending on which frequency, like a blue 5-watt laser. The really powerful ones are the 500 milliwatts, and those are blue, and much less a 5-watt laser. I mean, you could really do some serious damage. We didn't even think of even turning one on without a pair of goggles. Even the scintillating beam is enough to actually cause eye damage. But understanding polarity and pertaining to magnetism, we actually have to understand what nature's lines are, and that they cannot start from a Cartesian vector. I mean, you have to understand what is going on in a magnet. We're talking about the conjugate magnetodielectric field incommensurability that defines the magnet. Magnetism is merely the dielectric field. What's actually going on in a magnet requires that we understand incommensurability, polarity. You know, what do these things mean? I mean, we think we know what polarity means. Well, it has 2 poles, kind of like the Earth. There's a North Pole and a South Pole. That's polarity. No, that's not the case. You know, a magnet is not changed quantitatively. A magnet is only changed qualitatively. I always knew that laser light, for example, was not, the incorrect definition of laser light is not coherency of the light. It's a point source emission. It's spatially coherent. Like in a double mirrored laser, which I grew up with, helium neon lasers, is so brief that human beings could never see it. When you first turn on a glass tube laser like a helium neon, there is an enormous amount of time in there in which the light is completely incoherent. After several thousand bounces back and forth between the mirror, 100% mirror and a 95% mirror, does the energy become spatially coherent. It becomes a point source emission, and then you actually have laser light. This is why laser diodes are so effective, because a diode is a single point source. We talk about point source emission. This is why everything in lasers now is laser diodes. Importantly, too, a lot of people think that like laser diodes and laser pointers are emitting out that tiny beam. No, that light is columnated by a lens. If you actually remove the laser off of a laser pointer, it's going all over the frigging place. It's point source light, but it actually hasn't been columnated because that requires a lens. All these Blu-ray lasers and laser pointers, they have a lens in front of them. You know, a lot of people think, well, a laser is emitting out a beam. That doesn't work that way at all. So that beam is created by a lens in front of the laser diode. But understanding polarity is kind of hard. But when you actually understand polarity and three-dimensional, you actually understand the origins of what the hell a vortex is. And you actually understand this is where we get gyromagnetic precession from. This is where the origins of, people talk about magnetic vortex. And all I have to do is say, hey, what the hell's a vortex? I don't know. It's a vortex. Well, what is a vortex? Well, I don't know. The same thing with polarity. Polarity, what does that mean? Well, it has 2 poles. No, that's a description. That's not an explanation. Why does it have 2 poles, you know, in the case of a magnet? Well, it has a north pole and a south. No, the magnet doesn't have a pole. Sure it does. If a magnet had a pole, then you could slice it down the middle and separate out the 2 pieces. The magnet does not have a pole. There's no Cartesian topos or place where one pole begins and another one ends and a midpoint here. That's location, or topos, as the ancient Greeks Greek term belies. We have to understand the holographic paradigm. We have to understand incommensurability, and these are things that you were never taught in high school or college. You just weren't. You know, what the hell is incommensurability? If you do a Google search on the word incommensurability, unless you bring up like a PDF regarding ancient Greek, you're going to get the wrong answer. You'll find like incommensurability means it's incalculable. Well, that's the wrong answer. That's not what the term means, nor is it what it implies. Anyway, I hope you like these videos. This was just one part of one section of my lecture on magnetism. Thank you so much for watching, and good night. Bye.